this session is in the wireless access network stream, and it's titled the Goldilocks band. Maybe for starters, I'll introduce myself, and we've got two great panelists. I'll introduce them when it comes their turn to speak. So my name is Stephen Raymond. I'm at Ericsson. I'm VP of Technology Strategy for what we call networks, which is the radio business in market area North America. And I'm particularly focused on the things that we're doing with cable operators. Let's just say I have a lot of years of experience in telecommunications. In my previous life, we dreamed up and deployed some pretty interesting cable Wi-Fi networks that there are hundreds of thousands out on strands around the United States still in some of the markets. Very active in standardization and most recently CBRS Alliance and WinForum, which is very relevant here, and a bunch of patents. You can read all about it. And I'm a life member of the IEEE, which I think means you're getting old. I'm not sure, but something like that. So that's me, and I'll introduce the other gentleman later on. Okay. She said it might not work. Okay, and she was all right. There. All right, so today we're going to talk about what is this Goldilocks business. You all know the Goldilocks story, like the little girl who went running through the woods and broke into a house and complained about all the furniture that was in the house, right? Some of it was too small and some of it was too big, but the mama bear's furniture was just right. And the Goldilocks frequency band, which is kind of in the middle of all the bands that we deal with from a wireless perspective, is claimed by many people to be just right. So what I'm going to do, for starters, is just sort of, because I know a lot of you maybe aren't, I know some of you are wireless people, but not all of you. So for the ones that aren't, kind of explain some of the terms, give a little bit of the background about, well, why is it that this stuff in the middle works better than the stuff down below and the stuff higher up in terms of frequency? So why is it just right? And it's an important question, right? Because spectrum is the lifeblood of any wireless network, right? The decisions that you make about spectrum are critical in terms of the performance of the network and ultimately the services that you can deliver on that network. So it is a serious, not a comic book question, right? See if the clicker works now. Yes, it does. Okay. So a little bit on terminology. You hear people a lot now talking about, and this is fairly new over the past number of years, you know, low band, mid band, and high band. We haven't had so many choices in the past. I mean, in the cellular world, we focus mostly on the low band. And by the way, this is all North American terminology, right? So the low band, 700, 850, more recently, the very nice 600 megahertz spectrum that operators like T-Mobile and others have. Mid-band that we're focusing on today, and as you can see, there's not even like full agreement on exactly what it covers, but you can think about things all the way from 1.9 gigahertz, maybe you start at 2.3 depending on who you are, going up to 3.5 gigahertz, and 3.5 gigahertz is really important, and we're going to talk about it a lot in the session today, and maybe even inching it up a little higher to 6 gigahertz. And there have been other sessions where people were talking about 6 gigahertz as though it was a Wi-Fi band, and you know, 6 gigahertz is an unlicensed band. It's not a Wi-Fi band, and that's an important difference. And then you've got what's called the high band, also known as millimeter wave, right? So very, very high frequencies. It wasn't that long ago that you couldn't build, you know, the type of radios that a mobile operator would deploy. You couldn't build those radios cost effectively at 24 gigahertz and above. But now, of course, you know, we're able to do that. So those are the three chunks of spectrum, the three bands, if you will, that are talked about in North America: low band, mid band, high band, and we're going to talk a lot about mid band today. And just to confuse things even further, our friends at the Standardization World of 3GPP, they talk about FR1 and FR2, frequency range 1 and frequency range 2. Frequency range 1 is low and mid-band. They call it sub-6 gigahertz, and high band is frequency range 2. Hopefully that clarified, didn't muddle up. Coverage. When you're building mobile networks, coverage is king. Coverage matters more than anything else. And it's true for fixed wireless networks as well. Radio range, the distance that the radio travels, varies roughly with the frequency that that radio is operating at. That's Free's equation. You can go look it up if you want. So the range at the low band is better than the range at mid-band, is better than the range at high band, okay? So the distance that the radios will travel, and of course coverage varies roughly, very roughly with the square of the range. But it's never that simple. That's kind of an interesting, radio guys love heat maps, right? And that's a heat map in an urban area. And the lighter colors, the yellow color means you've got a stronger signal. The darker colors means you've got a weaker signal. Same area, 600 megahertz radios on the left-hand side, 3.5 gigahertz radios on the right-hand side. So you can see there's a huge difference in the coverage between those two sets of radios. So why on earth would you ever want to deploy a higher frequency? Well, it's all about throughput and capacity, right? The throughput of an individual radio, the cell throughput, depends upon the available spectrum and hence the channel bandwidth that that radio is using. So in the low bands, remember those 3 bands that we talked about? In the low band, the channel bandwidth is, typically 5 to 20 megahertz. I mean, back in the old days, we would have thought that's pretty darn good. In mid-band, there's more, 20 with the promise of up to 100 megahertz. And you've got the most channel bandwidth in the high band, 400 megahertz or maybe even more. So you can begin to see you've got this trade-off, you've got this balancing act between the coverage of the radio, the channel bandwidth, and the capacity that you can deliver. And speaking about capacity, those numbers at the top just talk about an individual radio. As you know, when we build out cellular networks, you've got multiple radios. And because the higher frequency radios cover less, they interfere less. And because they interfere less, the total network can deliver much more capacity. So you've got a multiplicative effect there of going up in frequency, right? Each cell has got a wider channel bandwidth, and you can reuse those bandwidths because the cells don't interfere with each other. But I think a lot of the experts in the business think that there is a sweet spot of balancing off those two, and mid-band, hence the Goldilocks thing that we talked about, a lot of people consider that that's the place. Just a little bit on acronyms, because just like the cable business, the wireless business is full of acronyms as well. And they're all explained there. PCS is an old term now, 1.9 gigahertz. WCS is an old term. Broadband radio service is a fairly recent term. Educational broadband service is a fairly recent term, as is citizens broadband radio service. And you see the acronyms on the left there, and you can see what frequencies they are. And again, just to make things more complicated, our 3GPP standardization friends give each of those bands a number. So you'll hear people talking about band 41, which is 2.5 gigahertz. You'll hear people talking about band 48, which is 3.5 gigahertz. Okay, that was sort of my introduction in terms of a little bit of background for those of you that aren't so much in the middle of all this wireless stuff like we are. So what I thought I would do is I'd have Craig go first. His presentation really gives a sort of a very good overview. Let me just introduce who you are, Craig, in my notes here. So Craig Schweckel is a principal at Encode, which is a subsidiary division of Ericsson. He's got 23 years of strategy and operations experience. He's been developing and launching high bandwidth services, and he's a leader in Encode's cable practice, working on MVNOs, Wi-Fi, and fiber deep engagements for Tier 1 cable customers. He holds an MBA from the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia and a BS in Material Science from Michigan Technology University. Craig, over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Did you have the slides?
Yeah, here, I'll show you how you do it. I think I know how to escape. It's always about escape. And we click that, and we go start.
Yep, that works.
That's worked? Okay, good. And here's the clicker. And you can use the arrow if it's misbehaving, but it should work.
Yeah, thanks again, Stephen. And thanks everyone for coming out this morning. Let's jog back to the question about who we are. So just as an informal survey, by the amount of time you spend in either wireless, wireline, or the dual threat wireless wireline pursuits, by a show of hands, how many people spend most of their time in wireless? How many people spend most of their time in wireline? And then where are my dual threat people at? Nice. And I think it's not to be funny, but it's something that's happening. It's the way the world's working these days, is that we have fixed mobile convergence. And so with IP infrastructure that the worlds are kind of mashing up. And so we have a lot of wireless discussions at the Cable Tech Conference. It didn't used to be that way. And so these days, I think wireless is very much top of mind, and it's very much in our world, and it's important that we learn the acronyms, that Stephen had mentioned, and we learn how it integrates with our businesses. So to build on Stephen's definition of low, mid, and high, I'm going to introduce maybe a new definition of what midband spectrum is. And this is something that's also evolving. So low band spectrum, it doesn't go down to ELF for submarine frequencies. We kind of think of it starting around 600 with the band 71 spectrum. And then it goes up to the 1800, 2100 spectrum that we look at, and that's been used for 4G LTE. And a lot of that's the workhorse spectrum that's in place now. High band spectrum, we can kind of easily wrap our head around that one. So high band spectrum, we think of it as millimeter wave often. Millimeter wave proper, or literally doesn't start until 30 gigahertz when you have the wavelength of that signal at a millimeter. But we kind of have this loose buffer from the auction 101, 102, 24, 28 gigahertz on up in the millimeter wave or the high band spectrum. And as Stephen said, some of those bands have very wide channel widths. Then what is midband? So the way we've defined midband here is at what point do you start getting some of those very wide channel bands? Where do you start getting 100 megahertz wide channel that you can do MIMO on? And that starts really around 2.5. So with some of the new rules that are in place or proposed for the 2.5 spectrum, we start to see that 100 megahertz and that 16 megahertz leftover channel being defined for the 2.5. And that's very interesting, and that's very important when we move into a 5G world, because those wide bands are pretty handy when you look at doing MIMO on that band. And then we also are able to combine many of these bands with some of the spectrum and carrier aggregation plans that we have, and we get something that's pretty interesting for a 5G world. So the way we've defined midband here is looking at 2.5 to call it 8. And that's a little bit of a soft definition on the upper edge, because there's still bands that are under exploration that are in that range. So 2.5 is really the workhorse that Sprint has, coming out of the WiMAX days, and that is very much in play today as a 4G LTE band, and they're looking at that as a 5G band. And Sprint has the majority of those licenses. So that band is 194 megahertz wide in total for the BRS and the EBS bands, which have their roots in education, in broadcast. and those licenses were resold and repurposed, and they're being used for other things now. There's still some chunks of that, though Sprint has 66% of one and 80% of the other. There's still some chunks in there that will go up for auction or will be traded and licensed in the future. Chances are that Sprint wouldn't weigh in on that, given financial considerations, and so those would be in play. Moving up from there, the other two that we're going to talk about today are the CBRS, which is this 3.55 up to 3.7, and that's very much in the news. I checked the news this morning again to see if there's any latest announcements on that. There's so much activity here. And then the third one is the C-band, which is the 3.7 to 4.2. And these are bands that kind of share the same propagation characteristics. You'll get some fall off, as Stephen said, in distance as you go from 2.5 to 3.5 to 3.742. But largely you'll be able to use the same grid. And that gets us to the part of the topic that I'm going to talk about, which is the business considerations as well as the spectrum policy considerations of this. And they're all kind of intertwined. I mentioned the news and something new in the news every day. 2 weeks ago, there was the official commercial launch of a CBRS with the CBRS Alliance 2 weeks ago today, launching a product there, and the SAS is spun up and that activity's in place. And people are deciding on indoor, outdoor, fixed and mobile IoT use cases, and they're trying to explore what that band means for the current GAA. The auction for CBRS is scheduled for next spring, so June 25th, 2020. And last Friday even, they just posted the rules and are soliciting for comments on the auction process for CBRS. So it's very much an active band set here that we're dealing with, and there's something new in the news every day. And your teams and your spectrum folks, should have their, finger on the pulse of this activity, just because the comments are very important. And everyone has something to say, everyone has an angle, and that push and pull of the politics of these bands does affect the business cases that you have. Even something as simple as, what is the bidding unit for CBRS? And it varies everywhere from DMA type sizes to census blocks. And everyone has an opinion of what that should be depending on where you're seated or where you're coming from. They landed on a county level bidding unit. So 3,200 bidding units, and they're gonna auction 70 megahertz in 10 megahertz chunks. And that roughly 22,000 units that'll be up for grabs next June are something that people now have to consider. What are they willing to pay for that level band? And that depends on what you're gonna do with it. What's it worth to you? So that's what we're looking at for some of these bands, and how the business considerations play into what the band means for them, and then how they're going to use it. C-band is still up in the air. So the latest estimate that we have is later this year, they'll have an idea of how to move forward with that band plan. C-band is reclaimed from incumbent satellite users, so from fixed satellite use and base station relays. And the C-band Alliance is a group that would push back as the incumbent on who wants to use the band. There's 500 megahertz that's up for grabs, but they have generously offered anywhere from 100 to 180 megahertz of that, while the industry would like 300 to 500. And so you can see the push and pull that would happen naturally with this. What's interesting about C-band, it would also be in 100 megahertz channels, so very interesting for 5G. It has very attractive propagation characteristics. And what that means is that if you have an existing grid that is based on coverage for PCS or AWS, that you could co-site some of these antennas on that grid and not dial up your CapEx and your infrastructure costs when you go to build out for C-band or for CBRS, depending on your performance at the cell edge. C-band is unique in that it won't be an auction. It likely won't be an auction when it comes out. It'll be between private parties and understanding of how to use that. But the indications are right now that the FCC doesn't want to go into an auction with that type of spectrum. The other side of the table, has pushed back on what it means for regulatory constraint and tying up the band in court, which, if you think about what that means, that adds 2 to 4 years to when you could actually use it, which would affect some of the value of the band. These all affect the business considerations of how you would bid for it, how you would deploy it, and when you could actually use it based on the spectrum clearing for these bands. So it's very much intertwined, and it's very much in play. When you look at midband, as we colored here in red, in the U.S. market, not a lot of folks have the current set of midband spectrum that we're defining. And for 5G, what we're recommending is a layered cake approach, where you have the low band for wide coverage, and then you have a midband for that Goldilocks of coverage and capacity, and then you have a high band for hotspot areas. And that really helps get the data off the RAN and get it onto a wire faster in some of those high congestion areas. So when you take a look at U.S. holdings across some of the operators, you see that really Sprint is the only one holding current midband spectrum, and this is licensed spectrum. Others are rich in 24, 28, 39 gigahertz high band, and then we have the most recent low band holdings additions from the 600 band 71 that complemented some of the existing band 12, band 14, 700, as well as the cellular and the PCS AWS. And those have been the workhorses. But as we go forward in this country and we look at what the FCC would call the 5G fast plan, they really want to force the issue and drive that mid-band growth here in the U.S. They say we're about at a fourth the mid-band spectrum availability as other G20 countries, and that's true through about the next year and a half. And when they look at what they can do to free up another 550 megahertz of mid-band, that starts to close that gap. From the FCC's perspective, from a spectrum policy perspective, they view mid-band as critical for 5G for maintaining competitiveness on a world stage. And what that means from a 5G perspective is CBRS is also dubbed the innovation band, because we have no idea what people are going to think of what to do with that. We think we do, but we don't. We thought we knew what people would do with LTE, and we were wrong. People were way more creative than we thought. Same thing with CBRS, same thing with 5G. On the next slide, I'll show some of the top-of-mind use cases, which are usually the acronyms that we see, the AR, VR type acronyms, but people will be way more creative than that. That's important for U.S. Policy perspective to remain competitive from a technology aspect on a world stage. 5G enables that, and they believe that 5G, with enabling these bands, will attract the smartest minds in the world to build on an infrastructure and a network that is capable and suitable for that kind of creativity. The creativity that we see spans the usual gamut of use cases, which lies somewhere on this frontier of latency and bandwidth. And these are the ones that you see in the news. You see these in the headlines. You see these at the trade shows. This is immersive VR in the upper right, immersive AR, and enhanced mobile broadband. And these are kind of driving the 5G use cases today, but likely won't be limited to it. What will be consistent, though, is in an IMT 2020 perspective, the 5G capabilities that are brought forth, which is low latency, high speed, high number of connected devices in a given area, high mobility with those devices, and high density on that, as well as having an energy efficient device. Those will be consistent across those use cases. Where midband can benefit is that it's kind of at the sweet spot of what IMT 2020 is forecasting for the upper edge of those capabilities. So midband can get you most of the way there. In many cases, it'll be a pretty good approach. Circling back to where we are now and where we need to be. So if we have 150 megahertz identified now, we have 844 to go to close the immediate gap. I'm talking about 3 bands here, but there are a few others out there. So one that we just missed the window on was the 3.45 to 3.55. That was a DoD chunk of 100 megahertz spectrum that they elected to go think more about. So that'll be caught up for another 3 years in thinking. There's this 6 megahertz band that is under consideration. I think Stephen mentioned that. And we loosely call it 6 megahertz, but really it's 5.9 to 2.5 up to 7.125. So it's 1.2 gigahertz. It's huge. There's the opportunity for not just 100 megahertz channel lists in there, but 400. And so this one has very much a push and pull between licensed and unlicensed. Is it the right band for Wi-Fi 6? Well, Wi-Fi Alliance certainly says so. And so Wi-Fi Alliance would be happy to claim the whole 1.2 gigahertz for unlicensed. But then the 3GPP folks and the GSMA folks would want to push back and say, let's make it all licensed, or have a lightly licensed, or a flexible use policy, similar to what we're doing with the the biggest flexible use policy experiment we have, which is CBRS. So these bands are still in that sub 8, sub 9. They still have decent propagation characteristics, and they have very wide bands that are available for use. And this is the approach that we'll go forward with in the next few years. This is the spectrum policy, the spectrum regime that we'll be living in, and the business decisions that you make around this will be greatly influenced by the decisions from the spectrum policy, because it affects the grid size, which it affects your CapEx deployment, it affects the use case that you want to go forward with, and then how that all interacts with the UE and the user community for actually using the bands that are deployed. On top of that is what it costs to actually get this stuff. So CBRS is coming up next, and CBRS has 70 megahertz of PAL, priority access licensing, available in 10 megahertz chunks, and any one operator can buy up to 4 of those in a county. Right now, if you looked at a kind of a US average, I would say it would go for around 13 cents per megahertz pop for that auction. Some say down to 10 cents per megahertz pop. Some say 0, because when you have 80 megahertz of contiguous and adjacent GAA spectrum, which is the general availability, that general access spectrum can be used instead of buying it at auction. It just depends on what your use case is and how much surety you want to have in that spectrum being on hand. The C-band is interesting because that one, based on its spectrum and what other markets have looked at, it could be 25 to 30 cents per megahertz pop, up to 40 cents per megahertz pop, if they get their act together and they don't drag their heels too much in getting it to the market. What really hurts the value there is the unpredictability of the band and how much you could use it. And then lastly, the 2.5, which is the existing Sprint spectrum, let's call it. But if the remaining parts would go to auction, what that could garner is up to 50 cents per megahertz pop. 2016 valuation of that put it at about 27 cents per megahertz pop for the Sprint holdings. And so that was 3 years ago, and now with the value of midband kind of growing in a 5G world, that has accreted up to about 50 cents. So you can see, how the value change and how that can dramatically impact your business case when looking at deploying this. I'm going to invite Dave up now, and Stephen's going to introduce him, and he'll talk through some of the deployment results and what we're seeing and how that affects the business cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great, that was very good. Okay, so our next speaker is Dave Morley. Dave is Director of 5G and Regulatory at Freedom Mobile, which is a Shaw Communications company and Canada's 4th largest mobile network operator. Dave's responsible for 5G strategy, trials, standards, and related spectrum strategy and policy. He's led the development and implementation of 4G LTE small cells and Wi-Fi technology. Dave has a PhD in EE, electrical engineering, and an MBA from the University of Alberta. Dave, welcome. With any luck. Okay.
That's advanced?
Yes. Should be, yeah. Sometimes you have to click it once on the...
Oh, yeah. Do you know if this is working?
I don't...
Oh, it is.
No?
Okay.
Okay,
perfect.
good.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you very much, Stephen, for the introduction, and actually Stephen and Craig for the overview of 5G, because that's going to make my talk a little easier. So I've got a lot of material to go through, so I want to jump right into it. What I wanted to do today is share with you some very recent results that we have from some 5G trials that we've been doing at Freedom Mobile. Oh, I see. All right. Page down, try that. Okay. Try, how about that?
I think if you... There.
Well, that worked.
If you put that there and click there.
Okay.
Okay.
Let me try this. Okay, all right, good. So this is just the outline for the talk. What I wanted to do is just spend a little bit of time kind of setting up or explaining the trial configuration that we used for these 5G trials. Also covers some RF coverage predictions that we did prior to actually doing the trial. And then quickly run through the test methodology, and then spend some time on the results, the test results, and then close with some concluding remarks on our findings. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this is the network where we conducted the trials. We had 3 existing cell sites in a suburban area in one of our markets. The intersite distances between those sites was typical for a suburban area in our network. So the intersite distances roughly between 1.5 to 2 kilometers, so a mile roughly to 1.3 miles apart. Tower heights for these sites were in the range of 30 meters to 40 meters, so about 100, what is that, about 100 feet to 130 feet or so, maybe 100, a little more than that, 140 feet. And so what we did in the trial was we looked at 2 5G bands. We looked at the 3.5 gigahertz, otherwise known as the Goldilocks band, I guess, and also 28 gigahertz. We also deployed base stations, LTE base stations in the 2.5 gigahertz band for reasons that'll be clear shortly. This slide shows the network architecture for the trials. So over on the left-hand side, we have a core network. This is an LTE core network with the usual functions in an LTE network. I won't go through those. We also had an iPerf server for some of the throughput testing that we did. In the middle, we have the radio access network, and this was replicated at the 3 sites. So as mentioned, we had the 3.5 gigahertz band, we had the 28 gigahertz band, and we had the 2.5 or 2500 megahertz LTE band as well deployed at those sites. Just note that we also deployed 600 megahertz at those sites. We haven't yet tested the 600 megahertz band. That'll be something we'll be doing later in the year. So at each of the sites, the base stations consist of basically what's known as a baseband unit, does the baseband processing of the radio signals, and they also have remote radio heads which do the RF, radio frequency amplification, down conversion, up conversion, all those functions. And of course, over on the right-hand side there, we have 5G devices, otherwise known as user equipment or UEs. So in the previous slide, I mentioned that we deployed an LTE core for the testing. That's actually just one of a few different variants of core network that you can use with 5G. It's one that's being deployed initially by most of the carriers. And what happens in the case of LTE as a core network for 5G is that the control plane traffic actually is carried over the LTE network, while the data plane traffic is carried over both the 5G base stations, also known as a G node B, sort of indicated on the slide over here. And this particular architecture that we used is known as non-standalone architecture option 3X. And the fact that the data plane traffic and the control plane traffic is being routed over both an LTE network and also the 5G network is something that's also referred to as dual connectivity. So one of the advantages of dual connectivity is that you can actually get a bit of a coverage enhancement from operating in that mode. And in this particular example here, we're looking at 3.5 gigahertz carrier and also a 2.5 gigahertz carrier or base station. And typically what you find in 3.5 gigahertz is the system is uplink limited, meaning that the coverage area for the uplink is smaller than the downlink. So if you were just operating in that band, your coverage would be restricted to that orange area shown here, which is a little bit smaller than the broader downlink, 3.5 gigahertz downlink coverage. But because we're using dual connectivity on a lower band, in some cases you can actually get a coverage improvement because the uplink can be carried on the LTE band in areas where you don't have uplink coverage in the 3.5 gigahertz band. So that's something that provides a bit of a benefit when it comes to operating in this dual connectivity mode. This is a picture of one of our cell sites that was involved in the trial. Over on the left-hand side there, you can see the various antennas and remote radio heads and the location where they're mounted on the tower. So the 2.5 gigahertz antenna was mounted right at the top of the tower. This is a 40-meter tower, so roughly 150 feet high. The 3.5 gigahertz radio, remote radio head was mounted at the 29-meter level, and the 28 gigahertz was at roughly about 20 meters above ground level. And we've got a bit of a close-up here of the 3.5 and the 28 gigahertz radio heads. In the case of these two remote radio heads, there's actually an integrated active antenna array that's mounted on the front of these radio heads. Now, in the case of the 3.5 gigahertz radio, there's actually 192 antenna elements inside of that, the antenna panel, the antenna array. And in the case of the 28 gigahertz remote radio head, there were 512 antenna elements. And so the benefit of having a large number of elements within the remote radio head and in that active antenna array is that you can start to do or start to create or form very narrowly focused beams from those antennas out to where the users are located. So this is a bit of a illustration of that, where by adjusting the phase and the amplitude of the signals that are going to the antennas, we're able to create these narrowly focused beams. And typically those beams are predefined and are arranged in what they call a beam set here. And this is an example of a beam set where we have 2 rows of 4 beams. But most equipment supports multiple beam sets. So depending on the coverage requirements, you can select different beam sets to tailor the coverage. These were the UEs that we used for the stationary testing. So one is Qualcomm UE. As you can see, these are still pre-commercial models. And this is showing the mounting of those units within the test vehicle. The other unit that we used was WNC UE, otherwise known as a mobile test platform. And yeah, both of these UEs, as I mentioned, were used for the stationary tests primarily. This slide has the system parameters for the trials that we did. I don't want to go through everything on the list. I was just going to point out a couple of things. One is that at 3.5 and 28 gigahertz, the system is configured in what's called TDD mode, which is time division duplexing. And in the case of the LTE base station, it's configured as full FDD. So that's frequency division duplexing. And with TDD, basically the radios transmit and receive on the same frequency, and then the amount of time they spend on either the downlink transmission or the uplink transmission is something that's adjustable. So in our case, we used an 8-to-2 split for the 3.5 gigahertz radio and a 4-to-1 for the 28 gigahertz radio. So in both cases, actually it's the same ratio. 80% of the time the radio was transmitting in the downlink and 20% of the time transmitting in the uplink. The other thing I wanted to point out is just the difference in channel bandwidths, as Craig and Stephen mentioned. At 3.5 gigahertz, there's a fair amount of spectrum available there, so we were able to secure 60 megahertz of spectrum for the trial. And in the case of 28 gigahertz, we were able to arrange for 4 100 megahertz channels, a total of 400 megahertz of spectrum. The only other thing I wanted to highlight here is I've got a line here showing what the maximum theoretical downlink speeds are for 3.5, for 28 gigahertz, and also for the LTE radio as well. And as you can see, theoretical max throughput on the 28, for example, is 2.2 gigabits per second in the downlink, based on the configuration shown above that. The other thing I wanted to point out is just the difference in the effective isotropic radiated power. This is how much power is being output by the antenna. So in the case of the 3.5 gigahertz radio, it's pretty hot. It's almost 78 dBm. And then you can see that the 28 gigahertz radio is quite a bit lower, about 20 dB lower at 57 dBm. Okay, so here are a few slides that show the coverage predictions. This first slide is showing the difference between the 3.5 gigahertz radio and the 2.5 gigahertz radio. As you can see, and this is actually showing what's called the reference signal receive power. So it's basically like a RSSI, receive signal indication. So you can see in the left-hand slide that the receive power is quite a bit higher at 3.5 gigahertz than it is at 2.5 gigahertz. And that's due in part because it's transmitting at a higher effective isotropic radiated power. And also it's got beam forming happening there as well. The next two slides show the downlink throughput and the uplink throughput. So here again, we're seeing the 3.5 gigahertz downlink throughput as performing at a much higher throughput than the 2.5 gigahertz. That's partly because it's got a lot more bandwidth, channel bandwidth, but also I guess the beamforming plays into this throughput as well. Next slide here shows the uplink throughput, and again, kind of a similar sort of scenario here where the uplink throughput on 3.5 is better than at 2.5, generally speaking. Here we have the 28 gigahertz coverage, and as you can see, the coverage area is significantly smaller than at 3.5 gigahertz. So virtually a small fraction of the actual coverage area is actually covered by the 28 gigahertz band in those G-node Bs. We've got a bit of a close-up here at one of the sites, and generally, from the prediction at least, we're showing that the coverage is probably in the range of 250 to 300 meters from the cell site. And wherever there are obstructions, like in this case, there's a building here, you can see that the coverage really doesn't penetrate into those buildings much at all. And here we have the downlink and uplink throughput for that same band. Downlink throughput is higher. We're showing here in the range of up to about 1.4 gigabits per second. And in the uplink, it's roughly about a tenth of that. Part of that has to do with the difference in the amount of time that the base station is transmitting in the downlink and in the uplink. And the other reason for the difference is that generally the uplink is limited by the power of the device that's transmitting that UE or user equipment. So that's the other explanation for why there's a bit of a difference there. So in terms of test methodology, what we did is we started with just some functional testing just to prove out that the system was working properly. So we did a bunch of LTE 5G interworking tests. We checked handovers. We actually checked beam forming and beam selection by the UEs, again, just to validate that everything was working properly. And then we got into some performance testing. So we did stationary tests. We tested latency. We tested the RSRP signal levels and also throughput based on stationary tests. And then we did some drive testing. So we collected a ton of samples, drove quite a lot of miles to see how the coverage was out within the entire area. These are the results for the latency. As you can see here on the left-hand side of the chart, we have the 5G latency. The median latency at 5G, this was at 28 gigahertz, was 8.5 milliseconds. And at LTE, the median was 32.5 milliseconds. So the 5G latency was a factor of 4, roughly 4 lower than the latency at LTE. And there's a couple of things going on here. One is that at 5G, the slot duration is shorter than at LTE, particularly at 28 gigahertz. So that's part of the reason why the results are better. The other thing, too, is there's fairly broad distribution here of results for LTE, and that's because we had discontinuous receive enabled on the LTE base station, which essentially puts the UE in a bit of a sleep mode before it transmits again, just to conserve battery life. So that's why we've got a fairly broad distribution there for LTE. The other thing I just wanted to mention is these results don't take into account a new feature or a feature that's available in 5G, which is mini slots, where the normal subframe is divided up into smaller time slots so that you reduce the amount of time that it takes to get an uplink grant on the system. So Once that it has been implemented, the latency results, we expect the latency results for 5G to come down quite a bit, probably in the 1 to 2 millisecond range. These are the results for the 3.5 gigahertz stationary tests that we did. The interesting thing that we found here is that although the 3.5 gigahertz received signal strength was higher closer into the cell site within about 200 meters, it was higher than the LTE coverage. Beyond that point, the LTE received signal level was higher than the 3.5. So this is contrary to what we were expecting from the coverage predictions. As you can see here, the difference, in the received signal level here was ranged roughly from about 13 dB to 4 dB difference in signal strength. So that was a little unexpected, and we think that there's obviously some model tuning that we need to do with the 3.5 gigahertz coverage model. And then on the on the right-hand side here, we've got the throughput results. So we're pretty encouraged by these. We were seeing downlink speeds of 340 megabits per second, which is very close to the theoretical peak throughput. By the way, this is with 2x2 MIMO. With 4x4 MIMO, those numbers would double. So that'd be closer to 680, maybe 700 megabits per second. And then on the uplink, we saw, again, very close to the theoretical maximum speeds of 36 megabits per second. This is the drive test results. So this is the route that we drove. And it takes a while to study this graph. So I've just sort of highlighted one area here where you can see at 3.5 gigahertz, we're kind of down into the lower received signal levels in this one area here. But if you look over at the 2.5 gigahertz coverage, we're still seeing, relatively good signal levels at that point. So that sort of confirms what we saw in the stationary tests as well. And then what we did is we broke it down even further. We looked at what were the received signal levels for 3.5 and 2.5 for various sectors within the trial system. So on the left-hand side, we've got at Site 1, Sector 1, we've got similar results to what we saw before, where the 3.5 gigahertz signal strength was higher close into the base station, but lower than LTE further away. At Site 3, Sector 3, they were actually pretty close. And what this actually led us to believe is that we've got a little bit of work here to optimize the coverage as well. We need to adjust down tilts, make some changes maybe to power, things like that, to equalize those. Sorry about that. I don't think I can go back. To try to equalize the coverage there. So still more work to be done on that front. Here are the 28 gigahertz test results. These are the stationary results. So RSRP, as expected, the further away from the site we get, the lower the RSRP values. In terms of throughput, kind of an interesting result here. We actually got our best throughput at the location that was farthest from the site. And I think the reason for that is within this RSRP values here, we're probably operating at the maximum modulation coding scheme level. In fact, I'm almost certain. These results, by the way, I just got on Friday, so this is all relatively fresh stuff. But so we haven't had a chance to really dig into it yet, but because we're operating at the, I believe, at the highest MCS value, that's why we're able to achieve, a high data rate here at, 280 meters from the site. How are we doing for 3 minutes? Okay. I'm almost there in the home stretch. Okay, so here are the drive test results. So we've actually overlaid the drive test results with the coverage prediction in this case. And the results actually line up reasonably well close to the cell site. The interesting thing is that further from the cell site, we're still receiving relatively high RSRP values at double the distance of where the prediction model says the coverage is going to end. Now, these are all line of sight locations. You can actually see the base station from there. But again, more work required on the propagation model here to get things to align better with what we're actually measuring in the field. So just to quickly wrap up then, sort of key findings from this. As we said earlier, in terms of round-trip latency, we saw roughly a 4 times improvement in latency versus LTE. At 3.5 gigahertz, we're achieving almost the theoretical peak throughput, 340 megabits per second. Again, that's with 60 megahertz channel and 2x2 MIMO. Actual coverage, however, was less than what was predicted, so we got a little bit of work to do to understand that. But having said that, just looking at the results and some of those coverage plots, we think that there is an opportunity here to provide seamless coverage at 3.5 gigahertz using our existing cell sites without any densification. And, you know, if it's not quite 100%, we can always fall back to LTE to sort of fill in the gaps there. So I think that's a great result from our point of view because it would really reduce cost. And then at 28 gigahertz, again, fantastic results in terms of throughput, 1.9 gigabits, typo there, that should be gigabits per second in the downlink. And that was with 400 megahertz of spectrum. Actual coverage was better than what was predicted by the model. And then seamless coverage, it's not in the cards for 28. But as Craig mentioned earlier, great band if you've got a high density location that's got a lot of footfall traffic and you need to cover a small area. And then lastly, just some additional work that we're planning to do as part of these trials we've been working on. We're going to be testing 600 megahertz on 5G later this year, and we're also doing some testing of backhauling 5G traffic over DOCSIS, and maybe that'll be the subject of a future paper. But anyway, thank you very much. With that, I'll turn it back to Stephen.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right, well, we've got 15 minutes left, so I thought we would just do Q&A. So first we'll take questions from the floor, and there's a microphone right in the middle. And I've got a few questions here too, but let's hear what everybody has to say.
Who decides the size of the channels? And is it just based on the fact that bigger's better, and in the higher bands, we just can make the channels wider, and therefore we do, because bigger's better?
Do you want to point that at anybody in particular? Or?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I'll take that. The quick answer is public comment. So the FCC has a starting point, and then they rely on feedback from all of the stakeholders. And you're right that it is based on bigger is better, so if it's more is available, they want to head in that direction. And the technology that's available today through carrier aggregation can put together a lot of the contiguous spectrum, but for MIMO, it's a little bit more efficient if you do have those 40 and 100 megahertz wide channels as you grow. But your intuition's right.
Hey, Dave, on 3.5, the 200 watt, how does that relate to what, I don't know what the limits are in Canada in terms of what you're allowed to operate at? Because that seems to be higher than I think what we can operate on CBRS.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the EIRP that I meant for the 3.5 in the testing that we did was 78 dBm. That's over 60 megahertz, so that translates to 70 dBm for a 10 megahertz block of spectrum. And with CBRS, the limit on EIRP is 47 dBm per 10 megahertz. So it's 23 dB higher than what's permitted within CBRS.
Maybe, I mean, I already had a canned question
Yeah,
on that
yeah,
front, so maybe
so-
I'll build on that a bit. I mean, it does seem, this is kind of a central question. We've taken a unique approach in the US with CBRS, which we're describing as, you know, we're sort of leading in mid-band spectrum in the US with CBRS. And it's quite different than the rest of the world. You know, China, Korea, there's now one Korean operator with over 3 million subscribers already running 5G NR at 3.5 gigahertz. And Canada's kind of in the middle between all of that. Do you want to comment on that at all, Dave? What do you think it means from a market? And
Yeah, sure. So, the structure's a little different in Canada than it is in the US. So in Canada, what they've done is they've set aside 200 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band. So it's 3.45 gigahertz to 3.65 gigahertz. So, and all of that spectrum is actually going to go, well, not all of it. All of it will be licensed for flexible use, but there won't be a spectrum access system involved, and there won't be PAL and GAA licenses in Canada. So it'll be auctioned off. Actually, the band is currently occupied. There'll be a reclamation process, and whatever is reclaimed will be auctioned off, much like any other auction for mobile spectrum.
thank you, Dave. Yeah. Another question, please.
Sure. Shahid from Cable Labs. First of all, a quick word of recognition to Dave and Shaw. Always a great partner to work with. Question, sorry, I missed the major part of the presentation. Did you talk about the mobility scenario under both 3.5 and 28? Because that's one of the areas of challenge because of lots of handovers, potential handovers from cell to cell if we're talking about like small cells, both under 3.5, and especially for the millimeter wave to 28. Did you tackle that as a use case, the handovers within the mobility scenario?
Yeah, we did, as I mentioned in the slide deck or during the presentation, we did some functional testing to verify that beam selection was occurring. So that was just sort of some spot checking. But while we were doing the drive testing as well, we can see the UE not only handing off from cell or sector to sector, cell to cell, but also handing off from one beam to another beam as we were driving along. So I don't have any results for that here, but that was definitely something that that was working, as planned.
More questions, keep them coming, yeah. Do you mind taking the microphone? Yeah, thank you.
I have a question about the future plan of 5G backhaul over DOCSIS. Are we planning to test it over the EPON fiber structure, or are we also planning to test the backhaul over the HFC plant?
Yeah, that was it.
You want me to try to start, or?
Oh, yeah, I think it was.
Oh, was it for
referring to
Dave?
our
Go,
feature.
please, by
Yeah,
all means, yeah, yeah.
So Michael's a plant. No. So yeah, I forgot to mention that, but in addition to testing 5G backhaul over DOCSIS, we are also looking at doing it over PON as well. Yeah, so both technologies.
I was just going to add, that is, of course, a big topic for this crowd, right? I mean, I know there's a lot of interest in using DOCSIS as a backhaul mechanism for small cells. And we've done trials, and it seems to work reasonably well. And, you know, you have to be careful to groom it correctly, and you have to worry about sharing of the medium between the backhaul from the baseband and, you know, you've got 6 other residential subscribers on the same cable port. You have to manage that, right? And then we can evolve that in the future as we move to the NR interfaces and so on. Yeah. So we don't want to throw away the DOCSIS plant. We can't. Fiber is obviously, you know, got advantages for front haul applications, but for backhaul applications, we think we can do quite a good job with DOCSIS. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to just ask about where the baseband unit was in relation to the remote radio head, and in the 28 gigahertz. how that CPRI link, from the point of view of, I heard that that was like huge bandwidth, and that there were some questions about whether the CPRI was going to be able to handle all that bandwidth effectively between, in the 28 gigahertz. So I don't know if you, maybe that's a silly question, but.
No, it's a
if you
good
comment
question.
on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah. Yeah, so the baseband units were actually, in all three cases, they were installed in cabinets at the base of the tower. Yeah, and then in terms of your question related to eCPRI or CPRI, actually in the case of the 28 gigahertz, I believe it was yeah, I believe it was eCPRI. So, and then I know there's been a lot of talk about using eCPRI. Well, in fact, I know it's part of one of the options for front haul for 5G, and part of the answer to whether or not it's sufficient depends on what the functional split is between the various functions within the base station. So I know that is something that is kind of an ongoing discussion at various industry forums.
Maybe for the rest of the crowd that maybe doesn't know what an eCPRI is. I mean, so these advanced radios now that have beamforming, what we've done is to put some of the lower layer processing that happens to do that beamforming actually happens in the radio. And that rather than having to have all 64 radio transmitters sending their data back to the baseband over some sort of a fiber link, you do some amount of processing in the radio and send that processed and hence bit reduced information from the radio to the baseband. That help? Yeah? It's my job to explain things, I guess.
You're doing a great job.
Thanks, Dave. More questions? This is good. Good to get interaction.
I'll ask another one.
Sure.
Dave, first for you, I don't know if you did latency tests between 3.5 and 28, and did you see any differences in 5G latency between that?
Yeah, we did. So at 3.5, I think if memory serves, we saw about double the latency as compared to 28. Yeah.
Okay.
Again, that's because sorry. Yeah, that's because of the higher frequency and the fact that the scheduling intervals are more frequent at 28 than they are at 3.5.
And second question's on MIMO for anybody is when you go, you're saying when you go from 2x2 to 4x4, you'd see double, but that's only if you have 4 discrete paths, right? So at 3.5 versus the high, the high is more reflective. Does anybody have any opinions what we should really expect as you go up in MIMO?
Do you want me to take a stab? Or?
Yeah.
I mean, you're right, there is a law of diminishing returns. With our 64 by 64 radios, which you typically use to deliver what we call multi-user MIMO, right? So you have one beam going to one UE while another beam goes to another UE and another beam goes to another UE. And we kind of see the ability to get up, 4 to 5 times capacity improvement with those multiple beams. And that's about as good as it gets at midband at 3.5 gig. Does that help? Yeah, that helps. Okay.
I'll keep the ball rolling with more
Thank you, Mark.
questions for you guys. So I missed some of the beginning of the test results, but my question is, well, there's 2 questions. One is, what kind of in-building testing did you do? Like, I know you did 28 gigahertz outside and 3.5 outside. Did you do anything like, non-line of sight inside or, 28 gigs inside? Yeah.
Yeah, we're actually doing some of that testing right now, so don't have the results yet. We did some kind of off-the-cuff testing indoors at 3.5, and actually it worked quite well indoors.
Okay.
In one location.
In one location.
Yeah, outside in.
Outside in?
Outside in, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other question is, did you do any testing that looked at the transition from 28 gigs to 3.5 gigs? I know there are different technologies and all that, but that's the big thing is, yeah. What are your
Right.
thoughts on that with the tests?
Yeah, no, we didn't do any. You mean like switching from 28 to 3.5
Yeah, exactly.
gigahertz as you left the coverage area of the 20?
Right.
Yeah, no, I think there was a limitation with our test setup to be able to do that.
Okay. Okay, cool, thanks.
Maybe just to wrap it up. Oh, sorry, Craig,
Oh,
please.
yeah, on the indoor-outdoor questions, great question from Midband. CBRS Alliance asked, and they found that just over half of users intended to use it for outdoor. So 53% outdoor, 47% indoor. Indoor for midband for 3.5 would be like IoT, industrial use cases, as well as factory coverage. And that's an important aspect of 5G and for midband is the interoperability, and not just with LAA extended to 5G NRU for unlicensed for the LAA version of that, but they want to make sure that Wi-Fi 6 and 6 gigahertz can complement midband spectrum going forward.
I was maybe building on that a bit. I was going to pose one last sort of, business-related question for, all of you or most of you in the room who are operators, cable operators, of course, here. But maybe, Craig, what kind of role do you see CBRS, which has a very different licensing regime? We've got unlicensed GAA, we've got PAL. How do you see that playing out with operators in the North American setting?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the story is unfolding. As we check the news headlines each morning, midband spectrum and CBRS as the innovation band presents an opportunity, but you can also see how it could present a threat because now you have more entrants that are coming into it. You have general access spectrum that's available. You have public cloud hosted core, so you can do a virtual EPC in the core on Amazon, and it almost democratizes radio access. And you can see where that might be a threat to cable codes, but it's also an opportunity when you start to look at suburban and urban infill, as well as near rural reach for extending the plant.
Great, thank you. I think it's a great opportunity for cable operators, so maybe it's a good place to leave it on that. I'd just like to thank the panel. I think that worked out very well in terms of theory and business and the actual practice, so thank you very much, guys.